Hey guys, Michael J. Crawford, the Anti-Trekker here, and before I get started, I do want to give a big shout out to Luke Fovark for upgrading his Patron support to the next level. Thank you so much, Luke. Even though I know you disagree with me on some of the Star Wars versus Star Trek stuff, I really appreciate your support to the channel. And I know you're a reasonable guy, and so hopefully as I go through these arguments, you will start to see where I'm coming from with some of this stuff. Now, last time on our Star Trek versus Star Wars, I compared the relative range of the weapons used by the Federation versus the Galactic Empire and came to a rather obvious conclusion that the Federation has a dramatic advantage in range. Based on on-screen evidence, it would seem that the range is in fact some 1,500 times greater for the Federation than it is for the Empire. Today we're going to talk about speed. Now, we're not going to talk about hyperdrive versus warp drive. That's actually reserved for a future video, so we will get into that one when it comes. However, we're going to talk specifically about sublight travel in both universes. But before I get into the speed factor, I want to address a couple of arguments that some people put out about prior video, and one main objection, the fact that I seem to be very one-sided in my prior video due to personal bias. Now, I will fully admit that I am a Star Trek fan first. That is, if I had to choose between the two, Star Trek and Star Wars, as far as which is my favorite, I'm gonna say Star Trek every single time. That being said, I have been a fan of Star Wars since 1977. Some of you may remember from my last Jedi review this childhood picture of me from, you guessed it, 1977. And make no mistake, who would win in a fight is not the same question as which is better. If you like Star Wars better than Star Trek, or vice versa, that is purely a matter of personal taste. It is not a reflection on your intelligence, and it's not a matter of being right or wrong. It is simply a matter of what you enjoy. However, while the question of which you like better is just a matter of taste, the question of who wins in a matchup is a matter of fact. For example, I happen to like Iron Man a whole lot more than Superman. But that does not change the fact that Superman would absolutely kill Iron Man in a straight-up fight. The fact that Superman is more powerful than Iron Man does not detract from my enjoyment of Iron Man in the slightest. Or to bring it back to science fiction, I happen to like The Expanse better than Stargate SG-1. However, any of the spacefaring races that we've seen in SG-1 so far, now I'm only in Season 3, so that's like the Asgard and the Goa'uld, well, they would completely curb stomp the combined forces of Mars, Earth, and the Belt. But that does not mean that SG-1 is better. Only that the level of technology on SG-1 is clearly more advanced than what we've seen in The Expanse. You get the idea. The difference between these examples and Star Trek versus Star Wars is simple. First of all, we love Star Trek and Star Wars with an absolute passion. We love them so much that we find it difficult to believe that anyone else could possibly disagree with us that our franchise of choice is better. Further, Star Trek and Star Wars are truly the progenitors of modern science fiction. Star Trek changed the game and introduced us to an idea of a show set in humanity's distant future in which we get over our petty differences and go out and explore the universe, meeting all sorts of interesting people and situations along the way. Star Wars showed us the idea that we could have a true action fantasy film set in space, that we could take the old myths and update them for a new audience, and it was incredible. Both are great. Mostly. But this is not a discussion about why lightsabers are cooler than batleths or why phasers are cooler than blasters. This is about who wins in a straight-up fight. Period. Now, let's get on to some of the objections. The first and most common objection is about the relative strength of shields and weapons. To be fair, that is an entire different topic, and I am going to cover that in a future video. A few people were bothered by the fact that I used information from The Last Jedi to cite the maximum range for the Imperial ships. The reason I used it is simply because, while it's clear that the firing range in the original trilogy is extremely limited, we don't really get an easy-to-see, clear view of what maximum range is until Last Jedi. And love it or hate it, Last Jedi is canon. And nothing about the range of the weapons that we see in Last Jedi is in direct conflict with what we have seen in any prior Star Wars film. Another common objection is to bring up the exceptions to the rule. So, for example, Starkiller Base was able to destroy another solar system from light years away. The Death Star's superweapon obviously can decimate a planet from a substantial distance. And of course, the ion cannon in Empire Strikes Back managed to take down a Star Destroyer that was in orbit around the planet. However, all these weapons have something in common as far as this particular series of videos, and that is none of them can be mounted on an Imperial Star Destroyer, at least not that we've seen. We do not have any examples in film of Star Destroyers firing ion cannons over great distances, having super lasers, or anything like that. And this is not a general all weapons of Star Wars versus all weapons of Star Trek. If this series is successful, I may actually expand upon it to that. But this initial series is just about the Constitution-class starship versus an Imperial Star Destroyer from the original Star Wars trilogy. That's it. And so we're not taking into account weapons that are not on either of these ships. Finally, a few people objected to my Star Trek example because in the episode The Changeling, they used a photon torpedo, and really the best comparison to the turbo lasers of an Imperial Star Destroyer is in fact phasers. Fair point.
Hold your fire, Mr. Chekhov.
Lasers locked on target. Range, closing. 75,000 kilometers.
Fire.
Got him!
Okay, now that we can put that behind us, let's move on. First and foremost, let me just say right off the bat, and I know probably 90% of you guys are going to agree with me on this, talking about top speed in space. In the real world, that's just a silly concept. We know that the only real speed limit in space is the speed of light, or the fact that you need an increasing amount of energy to continue to accelerate, and etc. And once you reach light speed, you would need an infinite amount of energy, blah, 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 Einstein relativity, yada, yada, yada. But in both Star Wars and Star Trek, the ships have top speeds. So love it or hate it, it's a fact in both universes, and so we have to go with that assumption that for whatever reason, be it some advanced physics thing that both these two franchises have discovered in their various time periods that we do not currently know, whatever it may be, speed limits exist in space in these two franchises. So let's talk about it for a minute. Star Wars is a little trickier. The main reason Star Wars is kind of tricky, to be honest with you, is that they don't flat out say how fast anything is in Star Wars. Now, there is a lot of interesting sources on the speeds of the various ships in Star Wars. However, nothing on film. Now, from what I could find, the general consensus as far as the top speeds of the three ships that I'm concerned with on the Imperial side, well, it's measured in a unit called megalights per hour. So, the slowest of the three would seem kind of obvious. The Star Destroyer itself has a top speed of 60 megalights per hour. The TIE Fighter has a top speed of 100 megalights per hour, which, by the way, is also the top speed of an X-Wing, if you're curious about that. And the TIE Interceptor, which is the fastest ship on the Imperial side of things, has a top speed of 110 megalights per hour. Now, from the sources I could find, 1 megalight per hour is approximately 100 meters per second, which means that a Star Destroyer has a top speed of approximately 6 kilometers per second, while a TIE Fighter has a top speed of 10 kilometers per second, and a TIE Interceptor, the fastest sublight ship we see in the Imperial Navy, has a top speed of 11 kilometers per second. Now, before I switch to the Federation side of things, I want to make it clear that I understand that many of you may want to accuse me of being biased against Star Wars. So, In order to avoid said bias, some time ago I ran all of these numbers by Captain George, who is a firm believer that the Empire would prevail. And I truly hope he'll do a response to my videos so we can have an open dialogue about this, but George agreed with these numbers. Further, in the interest of fair play, to allow for a margin of error, I will multiply the speed capabilities of all Imperial ships by a factor of 1,000. That means that the Imperial Star Destroyer now has a top speed of 6,000 kilometers per second, a TIE Fighter a top speed of 10,000 kilometers per second, and a TIE Interceptor a top speed of 11,000 kilometers per second. To be clear, I am taking the top speeds that Star Wars fans generally accept and agree upon and boosting them by 1,000 times for this battle. Star Trek, on the other side of things, is much easier to calculate. While in the original series, impulse speeds are measured in fractions, such as half speed, quarter speed, and full ahead. In other words, simple maritime jargon. In Star Trek The Motion Picture, we do finally get an on-screen reference to exactly how fast impulse drive is.
Intermix set bridge. Impulse power at your discretion.
Impulse power, Mr. Sir. Ahead, warp 0.5.
Now, some people have complained about how in Star Trek The Motion Picture we see the Enterprise leave Earth and then pass by Jupiter very soon after. However, it is kind of easy to understand when you consider the speed at which the Enterprise is moving. Warp 0.5 is not indicated in this film as top impulse speed. However, for argument's sake, let's just assume that it is. Warp 0.5 is about 1/2 of the speed of light. The speed of light being 299,792 kilometers per second. So, we can assume that the Enterprise is moving at a speed of approximately 150,000 kilometers per second. Jupiter is 588 million kilometers from Earth, meaning that the travel from Earth to Jupiter at full impulse would take a little over an hour. Just after we see the Enterprise pass by Jupiter, Kirk actually gives a log entry.
Captain's log, stardate 7412.6. 1.8 hours from launch.
1.8 hours. Given the time for the Enterprise to clear the shipyard and accelerate, it actually would seem like this is a bit too long time to have passed rather than too short. But let's not forget that the distance to Jupiter is not a constant. 588 million kilometers is the minimum distance. If Jupiter was on the opposite side of the sun, the distance would be over 975 billion kilometers, plus the extra travel time to orbit the sun. So I would say that the 1.8 hours is completely reasonable because it fits somewhere in that general frame between the 588 million kilometers and the 975 million kilometers. But wait! I can already hear some of you guys screaming,
"That's the refit Enterprise with new engines."
And you would be correct. Now, I could reply with something like, hey, this is still the original Enterprise in canon, it is the same ship just with some upgrades. Or I could also argue that while the warp engines, phasers, and shields are all mentioned to have been improved, there is no indication that the impulse drive has changed substantially from the original. In fact, its exterior design is actually fairly similar to the original. However, that being said, we will assume that the old impulse engines were only half as good as the new, which I think is being generous. After all, in the history of the Navy, has a class of ship ever doubled its top speed in one generation? I don't know, but I don't think so. But perhaps one of my subscribers who is a former sailor could fill me in. Anyway, until someone can give me a compelling reason not to, I think that I'm being more than fair by nerfing the max impulse speed of the Constitution class to half of what we observed it moving in, however not described as maximum speed, on the Enterprise class. So, that means that a Constitution has a maximum sublight speed for this engagement of 75,000 kilometers per second, compared to 6,000 kilometers per second for the Imperial Star Destroyer, 10,000 kilometers per second for the TIE Fighter, and 11,000 kilometers per second for the TIE Interceptor. Or to put it simply, the Constitution-class starship is about 7 times faster than the fastest ship in the Imperial arsenal. That is at sublight. When we get into faster than light travel, that's a different story, but that is also a different video. Now, with what we have learned here, I want to make sure that we understand the repercussions of the speed difference, and I'm going to illustrate it by bringing up a couple of comments from my prior video. Jay Wiggs said in the comments of my last video,
But on the flip side of this, if a starship focusing all its weapons on incoming fighters, the Star Destroyer could get into firing range in a couple of seconds.
to which Brandon G tried to respond with,
Well, yeah, and while they close the tens of thousands of kilometers between them, the Star Trek ships could get loads of shots off.
and Hector replied to Brandon with,
The Connie had phaser banks that need to be recharged between volleys and can only fire phasers in one direction at a given time.
So, let me say this. Assuming that our engagement starts at somewhere around 90,000 kilometers and the Imperial Star Destroyer launches its full complement of fighters at the Constitution, the fastest fighters at 1,000 times the maximum speed, that the bonus that I've given them, would be able to reach the Constitution-class ship in about 8 seconds. However, assuming that the commander of our Constitution-class ship is not an idiot, he would order the engines to be reversed and maintain the distance, which of course they could do indefinitely because of the speed difference. While Hector is placing an artificial limit on the weapons of the Constitution by suggesting that the phasers need to be recharged between volleys, which, from what we have seen, phasers can fire multiple volleys between charges. Further, there is nothing stating that only one phaser bank can be fired at any one time. We've just never seen the Enterprise fire in multiple directions at once because it was never really necessary. But even if we assume that they can only fire one phaser at a time, even if we assume that in between every single shot, there's a 30-second recharge time, even if we put all that into account, the Constitution could easily maintain the gap and pick off the fighters at whatever pace they choose. The only question at that point is the strength of the hull of the TIE fighter versus the destructive power of the main phasers. But again, that is another video. Take care.
Heart attack!
Well, that was easier than I expected. This is going to be a great day. And now, off to my first day of work on Endor.